Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
Mom leaned in close enough that I could feel the heat of her breath and said in that tight church voice she saves for moments when she wants control without a scene that I should please not make this about me. And I nodded because arguing in front of the centerpieces would only feed her favorite story about me being dramatic, and because I already knew I was not the one building a night on top of a lie. When I straightened up and reached for a water glass to stall the shaky feeling in my hands, Jason, my brother's best man, tapped my elbow and asked if we could step outside the doorway for a minute. And the way he kept his tone level while not quite looking me in the eye told me this was not a compliment about the venue or a request to help with a slideshow. He said I should tell them before he does, and I held his gaze and asked him to be clear because I am done translating half-truths from men who think I should read their minds. And he said there are messages and transfers and a timeline that does not match what everyone at this table believes, and that he is not going to stand up tomorrow and lie for my brother just to keep a family myth alive. I asked why tell me, and he said because I have a spine, because I am the one they all underestimate, and because if the truth explodes out of his mouth it will be chaos, but if it comes from me it will land like a verdict, and he actually used that word. Verdict, as if he had memorized the way my parents handle me and knew exactly where to press. I asked him how bad it was, and he said bad enough that if I say nothing I will spend the next decade watching the fallout while also getting blamed for not warning anyone. And I laughed in that broken way you laugh when someone tells you the weather after you have already walked through the rain, because it felt so familiar to be responsible for what I did not cause. He told me he had screenshots. He told me there was a payment to a vendor that does not exist and a string of photos that do not belong to a single night. And he said my brother has been telling 2 different stories to 2 different people and only one of them is standing in a white dress tomorrow. And even though he was trying to protect me, I could see he was also protecting himself because he does not want to be the villain of the speech. I asked for 5 minutes and he nodded, and when I walked back in I could feel the room shift around me in that quiet way families do when they have already decided who you are and are waiting for you to prove them right again. And I sat down and smiled at my brother's fiancée, who has always been kind to me even when my mother tried to make her an ally in the game of keep the daughter in her place. The rehearsal coordinator tapped a glass and began running through cues, and my father made a little joke about how my brother always lands on his feet, and everyone laughed in the practiced way people laugh when they want no trouble. And I thought about how many times I have been asked to be smaller so that the men around me could seem bigger. I took my phone out under the table and opened an old folder I kept for my own sanity. The one with the forwarded invoices and the late-night apologies, and the thank you for covering me this one time that somehow turned into a pattern. And I created a clean share link labeled vendor summaries so it looked harmless, and I added her email because she deserves to decide her own life with real facts, not stage lighting, and I set the delivery to go out in the morning at 9, which gave everyone here the night they were so desperate to protect and also gave me a way to say I did not make a scene. I simply told the truth to the person who had the most right to hear it. Then I stood and walked to the bar and asked for a seltzer, and while I waited I texted the officiant because he had given us an option to add a single sentence to the vows. And I requested a line about keeping no separate truths that would cost someone else their dignity, and he replied almost immediately that it was thoughtful and strong, and he would place it in the ceremony if both parties agreed, and I said that was perfect. Please ask them tonight, because if my brother wanted a performance he could at least audition for honesty. Jason drifted back beside me and asked if I was going to speak, and I said not yet, and he said good because dessert is coming and after that he is done being a lockbox, and I told him I understood, and that he should do what he needs to do, and I meant it, because I was done carrying the family's spin on my back. When I returned to the table, the coordinator called for a quick practice toast, and my mother shot me that look that says behave, and I raised my glass to the staff, and to the people who do the unseen work, and to the simple idea that love is not afraid of daylight. And the line hung there for a long second that felt heavier than the room wanted to admit, and my brother forced a grin and moved us along. Jason's phone lit up with a message, and he slid it toward me without being obvious, and on the screen were 6 words that made the blood in my ears pound harder than any speech ever could, because the text was from the woman my brother swore he had cut off since spring. and it read that she would see him tomorrow before he put on the ring, and I kept my face even and lifted my glass again, and my little act of revenge was already humming under the table like a motor I had finally decided to switch on. When I sat there smiling while the coordinator rattled through cues and my mother pretended not to watch me like a flight attendant eyeing a passenger she thinks might pop off, I could feel the old script lining up inside my head. The one where I do the reasonable thing and keep the temperature low and everyone goes home believing I am difficult, because I did not clap hard enough for a fantasy they insisted was real, and it would have been easy to slip back into that role because I have worn it for years, starting with grade school recitals where my brother's missed note got a pep talk about bravery while my perfect score on a scholarship test earned a reminder not to brag, and moving through high school games where his fouls were evidence of passion while my awards were treated like paperwork that should be filed privately, and by the time I reached my final year of college, I had become fluent in the family dialect of Hush, which is why the whisper tonight landed so cleanly, because it was just another verse in a song I already knew by heart. I remember the first time I covered for him with money because he called ashamed and urgent and said a vendor was going to cancel a deposit and ruin the surprise for his fiancée. And I told him I would float it for a week, and he thanked me like a man at a bus stop who swears the rain just started and then stands there for the rest of the season. And when the reimbursement never showed, I convinced myself it had slipped his mind because that was easier than admitting the truth, which is that convenience often wears the face of love in our family, and if you are the responsible one, you become the wallet, the driver, the early arrival, and the last to leave, and when you are a woman, you are asked to do it without looking tired. I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you because once you understand the rhythm, you can hear the beat under everything, even a wedding rehearsal, even a toast that sounds like a commercial for virtue, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it, which is why Jason's warning did not feel like a new problem so much as a familiar one finally saying its name where other people could hear. He had mentioned transfers that did not match the story, and I knew exactly where to find them because I had taken screenshots at the time, the way you photograph a leak before the landlord decides it is your imagination. And as the salads arrived, I scrolled through the folder labeled for my sanity, and I found the apology that thanked me for keeping his account alive during a weekend in which he had said he was sick at home. And the timestamps lined up with the dates of photos I had tried to ignore because I did not recognize the patio or the background, and I reminded myself that the point was not to punish, but to tell the truth where it mattered, which meant giving his fiancée real information before vows made it harder to move. And it also meant no more enabling disguised as discretion. So I made a second move that felt small and surgical and, if I am honest, delicious, because it required no speech and would not ruin dessert. And I walked to the lobby with my glass of seltzer like any other guest and asked the front desk for the security manager. And when he arrived, I explained calmly that there had been unwanted guests trying to access floors during wedding weekends, and that the couple would appreciate a strict policy for the groom's level, and I provided a brief list of names that should trigger a courtesy call to the bride before any key was issued or elevator access was granted, and I said it was out of respect for everyone's privacy, and the manager nodded and wrote it down and thanked me for thinking ahead. And I added one more step by asking the concierge to place a note in the day planner left in the bridal suite that read in plain language that any guest requesting access under the restricted names would prompt a call to her phone first, which meant that if tomorrow's surprise guest tried to ride up quietly, she would walk into a conversation she had not planned for, and that, to me, felt like justice without fireworks. Back at the table, my father told a story about my brother's first big promotion and how he had shown grit and instinct, and I felt my jaw set in that familiar way because I remember the grit I showed filling out forms at midnight so his license would not lapse. And I softened my face and took a slow breath because anger would feed the narrative I was already accused of, and I would not gift them that satisfaction tonight. Jason leaned toward me and asked softly whether I was going to warn her in person or let the paper do it, and I told him I had chosen the route that gives her dignity in choices, and that I would not be ambushed into a performance. And he nodded in a way that said he had expected as much and was relieved to be wrong about at least one member of this family. My mother asked what we were whispering about, and I told her we were discussing the seating chart, because I've learned that truth delivered later is often louder than truth pushed early, and she smiled the kind of smile that thinks it won, and I let her have it, because the scorecard I keep does not measure polite victories. When dessert plates clinked and the music warmed up and everyone relaxed into the illusion that nothing dangerous lived under the tablecloths, my phone buzzed with a message that was not from Jason and not from my brother and not from the fiancé. And when I opened it, I saw a friendly note from the hotel confirming that a guest with one of the restricted names had just checked in and asked for an envelope that included the groom's floor assignment, and my throat went dry in that useless way. Bodies have of announcing things you already understand, and before I could decide whether to walk upstairs or walk outside, I received a second message, this time from Jason. A single line that said, "The woman is already in the elevator and your brother just texted me to stall," and I put my glass down with care because I was not going to shake for anyone tonight. And my quiet little policy at the front desk had just turned into a trigger that would ring the bride's phone within a minute, which meant the next voice to echo through this room would not be mine. The call must have gone through because within minutes I saw her face change from calm hostess to something brittle, a look people wear when their mind suddenly splits in two directions. One half insisting the moment can still be salvaged and the other already running ahead to imagine the worst possible version of what comes next, and although she smoothed it over with a smile for the guests, I knew she had received the kind of notification that cannot be ignored, which meant the quiet safeguards I had put in place were already working without me raising my voice or throwing a scene, and that knowledge carried a strange mixture of relief and dread, because even if I had done nothing more than deliver honesty at the right time, my family would still paint me as the troublemaker, and they would do it with conviction. Jason found me near the bar as people milled around with coffee and casual chatter, and he leaned close enough that I could hear him over the noise, but not so close that it looked conspiratorial, and he said I needed to prepare myself because my brother had already been texting him, begging him to keep certain files off the table, and that meant the pressure was shifting from idle threat to active defense. I asked him what he had exactly, not vague hints or scattered anecdotes, but hard evidence, and he opened his phone and showed me a folder of screenshots that made my stomach clench, because these were not harmless messages that could be excused as old mistakes. These were ongoing conversations with overlapping dates and overlapping payments, proof that my brother had been funneling money to a second apartment under the pretense of business expenses, and there were receipts with my own bank transfer listed right alongside them, the one I had once provided to cover him when he claimed he was drowning in vendor bills. That was the moment I realized why Jason had insisted I be the one to tell it, because my name, my help, my generosity were woven into the fabric of his deception, and if this story came out sideways I would look complicit rather than victimized, which my parents would no doubt exploit to keep the spotlight off their golden son. I tried to imagine the fallout if Jason spoke instead of me, and the picture was clear. They would accuse him of jealousy, of sabotaging his friend, of trying to ruin a wedding, while I would be forced to stand silent or risk looking like I had coordinated with him, and either way I would become the scapegoat, which is why he pressed me so hard. Not because he wanted to see me burn my family bridge, but because he knew I was already standing on ashes whether I admitted it or not. I asked him if the fiancé had responded to the hotel call, and he shook his head and said she left abruptly to take a walk around the block, which meant she was either stifling a scream or plotting her own next move. And both options made my pulse quicken because tomorrow's ceremony no longer looked inevitable, it looked fragile, like a glass ornament balanced on a ledge waiting for the slightest nudge. The part of me that still wanted to protect my parents began bargaining in my head, wondering if there was a way to confront him privately and let her make her decision quietly, but the other part of me, the part that has been silenced at every milestone, kept whispering that silence only prolongs injustice and that every secret I had swallowed had cost me dignity I will never get back. I remembered the scholarship dinner where my parents skipped the ceremony because my brother had an out-of-town tournament, and the night they told me not to post about my promotion because it would embarrass him during his period of transition. And I felt the weight of those years pressing me toward a conclusion I had tried to avoid, which is that telling the truth is not about revenge for me anymore. It is about survival, and survival sometimes looks like revenge when you have been cast as the scapegoat long enough. Jason told me he was ready to hand me a flash drive if I needed it, and I asked him what exactly he expected me to do with it. And he said it was my choice, but that if I let the wedding proceed without saying anything, then he would be forced to step in during the toast. And I knew he meant it because his voice carried the calm of someone who has already decided on the cost he is willing to pay. I told him to hold it for now and that I would think about the timing, and he agreed, but his eyes told me he did not believe I would truly follow through, which only made me more determined, because I wanted the reveal to belong to me, not to him. When I sat back at the table, my mother leaned across the centerpiece and whispered that she hoped I had worked through whatever little storm had been brewing in my head, because tonight was not about me, and I smiled at her with the kind of smile that hides daggers, because she had no idea the storm she feared was already moving toward the horizon, and that this time she would not be able to silence it by changing the subject. My brother raised his glass to thank everyone for coming, and when he locked eyes with me, his expression begged for one more rescue, one more indulgence, one more time where I played the background character so he could shine, and I gave him nothing back. Only a calm stare that made him shift in his seat, because I wanted him to feel the ground shifting. I wanted him to know the safety net he assumed was always beneath him was gone. And as the plates were cleared and the laughter resumed, I opened my phone and scheduled one more delivery, this time to Jason himself, forwarding him the folder I had been saving for years with my own receipts and emails and late-night transfers. Because if he was going to hold leverage, then so would I, and this way neither of us could back down without dragging the other into it, which meant the balance of power had shifted again, and for the first time in years it tilted toward me. She came back to the room with that careful smile people wear when they are deciding what to do with information that could change their life, and I could see the effort it took for her to hug an aunt, answer a question about flowers, and pretend nothing had shifted while the coordinator rearranged the order of toasts, and in that moment I understood that my job was not to explode the night, but to pry open a window and let daylight in, which is why when the officiant cleared his throat to walk us through the ceremony notes, I raised a hand and asked if he would include the single sentence I had sent earlier about keeping no separate truths that would cost someone else their dignity. And he smiled and said it was strong and modern and entirely appropriate if both partners were comfortable, and then he turned to them and asked gently whether they wanted that promise in their vows. My brother did that half laugh he uses when he wants to turn a serious thing into a joke, and he said it felt a little intense for a wedding, and my mother chimed in with a comment about how every couple has their own private language, and my father added that families sometimes need space. And the chorus of soothing nonsense rose up like it always does when something real threatens to enter the room, and I just watched the fiancée, because she did not join the chorus. She simply looked at him and waited for a clean yes that did not arrive. Jason, who understands timing, coughed into his hand and said that as best man he thought the line was terrific, and a few friends nodded because the air had changed and they felt it, and the officiant waited with his pen. And the coordinator sensed the tension and tried to move us along, and my brother finally said that of course he is for honesty in general, but he is not sure about unusual lines that could distract from the moment. And that answer landed like a dropped plate because everyone here knows the difference between a preference and a refusal. I did not say a word. I did not have to. The room understood that a simple yes had become complicated, and the fiancé's eyes did not leave his face, which told me she had received the call from the desk and had not dismissed it as nonsense, and that she was now recalculating her life hour by hour. The coordinator announced a practice toast and asked if I wanted to go first, and before my mother could reach for my elbow, I stood and lifted my glass and said I wanted to thank the staff and the vendors and the people who make beautiful things happen without applause. And I mentioned that as part of my gift I had covered a handful of deposits in the past months because I believed in supporting love, and then I let that hang there for one beat before I turned to the coordinator and said I needed to update the file tonight so that all remaining balances and authorizations sit with the couple, as they should, and that I would be stepping back from any further payments. The words were polite and almost boring, yet the effect was not, because the coordinator, being a professional, immediately replied that this was doable and that she would need a working card for the final guest count and the bar minimum before everyone left. And her tone was neutral, but the subtext was loud, and my brother's smile froze just enough that even the people who never notice anything noticed that something had landed. My mother tried to turn it into a gracious gesture, saying how generous I had been and how unnecessary it was to do more, and I nodded and agreed and said exactly, "No more," and the look she shot me could have sliced glass, because she heard the double meaning and she knew the leash had slipped from her hand. My brother leaned toward me and whispered that I was making things complicated, and I whispered back that weddings are expensive and lies are more expensive, and if he wanted the fairy tale then he could pay for the fog machine himself. Jason clinked his glass lightly as if to break the spell, and said he would help the coordinator gather what she needed, and the fiancé, steady as a surgeon, asked the coordinator to bring the paperwork to her, not to him. Which told me her walk around the block had not been about cooling off, but about choosing a path. The coordinator returned with a folder and spoke softly about the schedule for the morning and how the venue needed the confirmation on the bar package and the overtime contingency, and she apologized for the timing. And then she said the quiet part that sent a chill through the table, which was that the card on file had flagged earlier, and they had been planning to address it at the end of the evening, and would the couple prefer to use a different card now so nothing delayed tomorrow's setup. My father set his napkin down and stared at his son, and my mother straightened like a wire, and my brother looked at me because habit is a powerful drug, and I let the silence sit there and do the work I used to do with my wallet. And after an endless breath, he turned to his fiancée and said they would handle it later, and she said no, we will handle it now, and then she reached into her bag and placed her own card on the folder with a calm that came from a place I recognized, the place where a woman decides she will not be played again. I took my seat and tasted my water and felt the tiniest tremor leave my hands, because my revenge tonight was not a speech or a scene. It was a clean cut through a pattern that kept me small. And the sound it made was the sound of responsibility landing in the right lap at last. The coordinator stepped away to run the payment. Jason watched my brother with a look that said the clock had reached its final minute. My mother's face tried to reset the evening with a cheerful anecdote that nobody heard. And in the pocket of that silence my phone lit with a new message from the officiant, a short line confirming that he had added the honesty vow to the program and that only the signatures were needed to lock it, and when I looked up the fiancé was already watching me, steady and unblinking, and then she asked the officiant to read that sentence aloud right here so everyone could hear it as written, and my brother opened his mouth to stall and found no words at all. The message I had scheduled went out in the morning exactly as planned, and before the coffee cooled on the hotel nightstand my phone buzzed with a simple request from her asking if we could speak alone for a few minutes. So I met her in a small sitting area off the lobby where the noise of the elevators swallowed the edges of our voices, and I told her I was not here to perform or to win points. I was here because I refused to let another woman stand in a spotlight built on a lie I had been asked to hold steady, and I handed her the clean folder with the receipts and the transfers and the apology threads I had kept for my own sanity, and I said she did not owe me a reaction and she did not owe me a public scene. She only owed herself a decision made with all the information that people tried to keep from her. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 steady questions about timelines and overlaps, and then she thanked me in a voice that did not wobble, and she said she would handle the rest, and she asked me for one favor that surprised me with its restraint, which was to keep the room calm until she chose her moment, because she did not want a rescue, she wanted agency. By the time the aisle rehearsal reformed into a real procession, the officiant already had the addendum printed on a single clean sheet. And when he asked them to sign beneath the line about keeping no separate truths that would cost someone else their dignity, she reached for the pen without hesitation and wrote her name with a clarity I envied. And then he turned to my brother, who made a joke about legalese and said something about trusting feelings over paperwork, and the officiant, to his credit, did not move the pen away. He simply waited, and the silence did what I hoped it would do. it made the refusal visible. And it carried across the first rows to the back where relatives who never notice anything suddenly leaned forward because they could sense the script had slipped. My mother tried to bridge it with a whisper about saving unusual lines for anniversaries, and my father muttered something about tradition, and Jason stood with the rings and watched the pen hover an inch from the paper while my brother searched for a path that would not cost him anything, and when he could not find one he set the pen down and said he would rather keep vows simple, and that was the moment when the ground finally moved. She did not raise her voice and she did not cry. She asked the officiant if she could address the guests before the music resumed, and he stepped back because he understood the ceremony had already changed shape, and she said she loved the idea of celebrating love. And that love without truth was a costume she would not wear, and then she thanked everyone for getting dressed and showing up and spending money and taking time, and she said the food would still be served because the staff deserved their work to be seen, but there would be no ceremony today, and when the first gasp traveled like static across the room my brother reached for her hand and said they could talk privately. And she pulled her hand gently away and said the talking should have happened before the second apartment, before the payments routed through other people's accounts, before the private messages that landed in her phone last night when someone tried to ride an elevator that we had asked the hotel to monitor. And she did not look at me once while she said it, which was exactly how I wanted it, because this truth belonged to her. My mother turned her shock on me as if I had spilled something sticky on the carpet and she could fix it with scolding, and I let her stare bounce off me because the part of my plan that mattered now was not the reveal, it was the accounting. And I walked to the coordinator and, in a steady voice, asked her to finalize the transfer of every deposit I had covered into the bride's name and to process the release of my card from any open authorizations, and I handed over the written instructions I had prepared the night before that authorized refunds to be directed to the bride for any vendor who allowed cancellations without penalty, and to be credited to her for any vendor who pivoted services to a non-wedding event. Because today would belong to her choices, not to his mistakes or my history of cleaning them up. The coordinator nodded like a professional who has seen every version of human mess, and she moved with purpose, and I felt the relief that follows the moment you finally return what was never yours to carry. Jason closed the ring box and placed it gently on the table between the bouquets and the programs, and in the clean space that followed he said, as a friend, that he had nothing useful to add that had not already been said by the person who mattered most. And he stayed where he was so that no one could claim later that he had orchestrated this, because he had not. He had simply refused to lie. My father began a speech about family weathering storms, and my mother murmured about forgiveness, and I let them spool their platitudes for a breath longer than comfort required. Then I leaned in just enough for them to hear and said that storms are not excuses for theft, and they are not shelters for cowards, and that from this day forward my accounts are closed to their emergencies, my time is closed to their spin, and my name is closed to their fables, and if they tried to tell a new version in which I ruined a wedding, they would find the dates on the transfers and the messages inconvenient too. Their narrative, because the timeline was now public enough to bite. When I turned to leave, my brother asked if there was anything he could say that would change my mind, and for a flicker I almost laughed at the symmetry of the question. Because for years I had been asked to bend and smooth and carry, and now he was asking for the shortcut I used to provide, and I told him the only sentence that mattered had already been offered on a single line about keeping no separate truths, and he could not sign it, so there was nothing left to discuss. I walked past the tables without looking down, feeling the quiet hum of a motor I had finally allowed to run, and at the doorway I paused only long enough to send one final message. A simple note to the coordinator authorizing an extra hour of bar service charged to the house account I had moved into the bride's name so that the guests could eat and drink and tip well, because grace does not require pretending. It only requires an honest ledger, and mine, at last, was clear.